Dear students, welcome to the class on Nissim Ezekiel. Today I will talk about Ezekiel with a particular focus on him as a poet who brought into Indian English poetry in particular and Indian English literature in general a new wave of modernism, as many critics tend to affirm, including that famous critic called Bruce King. I will refer to Bruce King and his works extensively later on in the lecture. But for the moment, I will argue that Ezekiel was a modern poet who, although influenced by Western tradition of modernism, was transforming this modernism into a kind of Indianized version of modernism. And he achieved the level of being called a modern poet, modern Indian English poet, by portraying Indian reality with Indian experience. So, let us focus on how I plan to proceed in the lecture. Now, the points that I have chosen to discuss are these. First, I will focus on Ezekiel's short biography. Then I will discuss his poetical collections as he published them chronologically, and I will also focus them chronologically. Then I will try to draw some general themes in his poetry, general themes which bind his collections. Then lastly, I will discuss the two poems, and these two poems are in your syllabus, in your postgraduate syllabus. But first, his short biography. Unless and until we have a kind of cursory glance into his biography, it won't be easier for us to have an understanding of him as a poet. So let us have an understanding and a cursory glance into his biography. He was, as you might know, was born into a Jewish Indian family in Bombay, now Mumbai, in the year 1924 and died in 2004. And he was a Bene Israelite, and he died at the age of 80, like our Rabindranath Tagore. Between that, he wrote not just poetry. I mean, he is regarded chiefly as a poet, but he tried his hands at playwriting, at book reviews, at critical essays, etc. He was born into a well-educated family. His father was also a teacher. He went to London in 1948, came back 3.5 years later, that is in 1952, and tried and took up various career opportunities. I mean, when he was in London, he led a kind of bohemian life. He didn't have any fixed job. He studied various things and so on. Later on, he went on to when he came back in India and built up a proper poetic career, he later on went on to win two prestigious awards, that is the Sahitya Academy Award in 1983 and Padma Shri Award in 1988. But the aspect that I hold to be important is that he was also an academician, a teacher who wrote poetry. So much like many of modern poets who are academician and poet, Nissim Ezekiel was one of them. like you may compare with our very famous poet Sangho Ghosh. He is an academician and at the same time a very famous poet writing in Bangla. He struggled initially to publish his poems, but with time he established himself as a poet. This I will focus later on as a note on his struggle as a poet to be published. It's this graph that we will look into, a graph that builds him as a modern poet. So in this lecture I will try to focus on Ezekiel as a modern poet mainly. Now let us have a look into his poetical collections, what he wrote over the time. You can have a look on the slide and understand how he published his poems. When he came back from London after 3.5 years, he published his first collection, that is A Time to Change, which was published in 1952. Then in 1953, I mean immediately the next year, he published his next volume, 60 poems. Then in 1956, The Discovery of India. Then in 1959, the third. Then the next year in 1960, he published The Unfinished Man. Then after 5 years, the exact name was published. Then after a long gap of 11 years, this is very important, after a long gap of 11 years, he published Hymns in Darkness, which was published in 1976, and in 1982, Latter Day Psalms, which was his last and 7th collection. Now these are the collections, but between these collections he wrote some sporadic poems which were not collected and not published as a volume, but they were published separately perhaps. And in 1989, Oxford University Press brought out his collected poems 1952 to 1988. So we can say that his creative period consists of from 1952 to 1988, almost 40 years, you may say. Here are some of the poems that belong to various collections. You may have a look on the slides and can note down the poems that belong to various collections. For your understanding and for your convenience, I have noted down some poems that belong to these collections, and let me read out the names of the poems and the collection very quickly. A Time to Change, this is the name of the collection, which was published in 1952, as I told you, and this was published from the Fortune Press. And the poems, and there are many poems in this collection. The poems that belong to these collections are these: A Time to Change, this is the title poem; On an African Mask, the double horror; then On an African Mask, the double horror; On Meeting a Pedant, Robert; Poetry, Something to Pursue. And this poem, Something to Pursue, was dedicated to his brother Joe, To a Certain Lady, In Emptiness, etc. 60 poem, this was published in 1953, and in this slide you can have you see there are two collections, 60 poems and the third, and these two collections, which are published in 1953 and 1958 respectively, are both privately published. So he didn't have any publication houses for these two collections initially. And the poems that belong to the 60 poems collection are these: A Poem of Dedication, The Stone, The Crows, Song, Situation, Marriage Poem, Boss, Two Nights of Love, A Poem of Blindness, Prayer Poems, Nakedness Poems, Remember and Forget, etc. 1 minute. There are many other poems I have not included here because of paucity of space. In the third, you have such poems as Portrait, Division, Waking, Admission, Memo for a Venture, Advice, Paean, Aside, Declaration, Tonight, The Card, In the Queue. I'm reading from the Oxford collection. Conclusion, Two Adolescents, Episode, Wisdom, Situation, For Love's Record, The Language of Lovers, etc. This is also a very long collection and mainly consists of very short poems. In this collection you won't have poems which are very long. Okay, in the next two volumes we have these poems. Now the similarity between these two volumes is this, that both the volumes are published from the publication house called Writers Workshop, which is located in Kolkata. The Unfinished Man was published, and Ezekiel had a friendship with P. Lal, the owner of this publication house, the Writers Workshop. The Unfinished Man was published in 1960. 1960, and the poems that belong to this collection are these: Urban, Enterprise, A Morning Walk, Love Sonnet, Commitment, Morning Prayer, Event, Marriage, Case Study, and Jamini Roy. Now in this collection you have only 10 poems, so it's a very short collection. The next collection is The Exact Name. Again, it's a Writers Workshop publication, and this was published in 1965. And this contains the following poems: Philosophy, Night of the Scorpion, In India. Now in India, under this title, you have 4 poems: The Visitor, Progress, A Warning, Virginal, Beachstone, etc. So many anthologized poems are from this collection, The Exact Name. Philosophy and Night of the Scorpions are two of his most anthologized poems. In the next collection, that is Hymns in Darkness, which was published in 1976. The dominant tone is religiosity. In fact, in both Hymns in Darkness and Latter-day Saints, the dominant tone is religion or spirituality. Hymns in Darkness contains these poems: Subject of Change, Background Casually. Background Casually is also a very important and very popular poem. Island, The Couple, The Railway Clerk, The Truth About the Floods, On Bellasis Road, Goodbye Party for Miss Puspoties, Hymns in Darkness. This poem is in your syllabus, Hymns in Darkness. It's a very long poem. You have 16 divisions in this poem. Latter-day Saints, which was published from the Oxford University Publication House in 1982, is an important contribution to Indian English poetry, as some critics think. And the poems that belong to this collection are these: Counsel, Poverty Poem, Healers, Hangover, Warning, 2 Sonnets, Jewish Wedding in Bombay, Latter-day Saints, etc. So thus we may note down the poems that belong to various collections and move on to the analysis of the general themes of his poetry. The themes which bind his collections. Now, this is very important because most of the critics of Indian English literature and Indian English poetry see Ezekiel as the first modern Indian English poets, and they hold the opinion because they primarily think that Ezekiel brought in a professional attitude to Indian English writing and practice, and with that professional attitude he tried to set some tradition. So it would not be wrong to call him, on the part of us, a path breaker. So it would not be wrong on the part of us to call him a path breaker, a tradition setter, because Ezekiel's poems are no longer marked by nationalist sentiments or what you may call visionary attitude as his predecessors' poems are. His poetry is not lyrical, nor in his poetry can be found an attitude of pretension. So there is no tone of lyricism, there is no pretension, there is a kind of clear straightforwardness. Rather, we may say his poems are straightforward, as I was telling you, realistic, and at times unconventional in their frankness and forthrightness. So broadly speaking, his poetry can be divided into two categories. This is again very important. Please note it down. His poetry can be divided into two categories: retrospective poems and introspective poems. And I hope you understand what I mean by retrospective poems and introspective poems, because the labels themselves speak of the theme. Retrospective poems which talk about past, and introspective poems which deal with introspections, a greater understanding of his life and philosophy. But my friend, so these are the two primary categorizations: retrospective poems and introspective poems. But my friend and an excellent teacher, he's a friend from my college days, Professor Borun Naha, adds another division. And Borun adds the division called metrospective poems. So we have three categories to add to Professor Naha's addition, that is retrospective poems, introspective poems, and metrospective poems. So we have in total three categories. But there is always more than these easy categorizations. We as scholars, we as teachers tend to categorize everything for our understanding, for our analysis. But there remains always something more beyond this easy labeling, easy categorizations, as there can be found themes of love, marriage, nudity or nakedness, religiosity or spirituality, prose getting translated into poems, and so on. Prose getting translated into poems is called found poems. He developed a technique called found poem, which is very unique in not just, I think, Indian English tradition, Indian English poetry, but in world poetry. Because nowhere did I find anything called found poem. What is this found poem? Found poem is the technique of writing verse lines from prose. I mean, transforming the prose lines into verse line without changing too much. More than anything else, what this easy categorization misses is to unfold his portrayal of spirituality and religiosity. I mean, if we look at these three categorizations, retrospective, metrospective, and introspective, you will not find anything called the portrayal of religiosity. Yes, you may include into the category of introspective poems the theme of the portrayal of religiosity, but this particular theme, this particular aspect of Ezekiel's poems is so important that we need to look at it separately. Now this particular theme, that is the theme of spirituality and religiosity, is chiefly apparent in his in his last two collections, that is Hymns in Darkness and Hymns in Darkness, which was published, as I told you, in 1976, and Latter Day Psalms, which was published, as I told you, in 1982. Now let us try and look at his volumes one by one, and I think that would be easier for us to have a complete understanding of Ezekiel as a poet, and also what he wrote in his entire poetical career. After that, I will argue why Ezekiel is called a modern poet. So first, let us look at his collections one by one. I mean, I have already talked about his collections and the poems, various poems that belong to various collections, but here is a discussion on the poems, on the collections, as the general themes are concerned. Now his first collection is A Time to Change, and that is very significantly titled, as some critics have held that A Time to Change, which was published in 1952, is very significantly titled because it was really a time for a change in how Indian English poetry would take its course, and that change was brought in by none other than Ezekiel, who came from London after spending a kind of bohemian life to India to write poetry and take up poetry writing as his professional career. Now Sudesh Mishra, one important critic, Sudesh Mishra, in his study, this is very important, you remember the name of the study, Preparing Faces, Modernism and Indian Poetry in English. Preparing Faces, Modernism and Indian Poetry in English, makes this point that with this publication he tried to make a, quote, clean break with the romantic past, unquote. I repeat, Sudesh Mishra says that with this publication, that is A Time to Change, Ezekiel tried to make a, quote, clean break with the romantic past, unquote. So as I was telling you, his poetry is not lyrical, and we will not find in Ezekiel's poems the tone of nationalist sentiment or visionary attitude. Nor do we find in his poems a kind of romantic tradition, European romantic tradition. This volume, that is A Time to Change, was published from Fortune Press, and the poems mostly deal with conduct, judgment, behavior, or passion of mind and heart. One thing that you should take note of, that is Ezekiel is often held as the poet laureate of the ordinary. Ezekiel is often held as the poet laureate of the ordinary. I mean, there is a critic called Arvind Krishna Mehratra, and Mehratra, in his book An Illustrated History of Indian English Writing, Indian Literature in English, calls Ezekiel as a poet laureate of the ordinary. I mean, Ezekiel has the power to transform mundane, ordinary stuff into his subject matter of poetry. That is very important. Now, let us go back to the volume, A Time to Change. Although the poems in the volumes range in manner, rhythm, and style, there is an underlying consistency or preoccupation in Ezekiel's desire for a lucid, personal, poetic voice. That is very important. Lucid, personal, poetic voice in which emotion and reason will be balanced. And this is the opinion put forward by Bruce King in the book Modern Indian Poetry in English. Now, I repeat what King says because, again, this is very important. King says, quote, although the poems in the volume range in manner, rhythm, and style, there is an underlying consistency of preoccupation in Ezekiel's desire for a lucid, personal, poetic voice in which emotion and reason will be balanced. So he balances between emotion and reason. Now his reason, I will argue later, is based on realism. I mean the I mean his experience of mundane reality of India. His next volume, that is 60 poems, which is again, which is privately printed, has 18 newly written poems along with some unpublished poems written earlier. I told you we have only 7 volumes of his poetry, 7 published volumes of his poetry, formally speaking. But between them, he wrote some poems sporadically, and they were not published initially as a volume, but they were later published. The poems in this volume, that is 60 poems, are better phrased. So there is a development as he published his second volume in terms of his poetic style, in terms of his phrasing of poems, in terms of rhythm, in terms of logical argumentation. So there is a progress from his earlier poems, as the poem registered a clear shift from the earlier volume. His next volume, that is the third, is also privately published, privately printed, and is stylistically more unified than the earlier books. And the Yeatsian influence is quite clear. The intellectual self-control, steadiness, metaphoric use of details, and a greater observation of not just society but also life mark the poems of these volumes. So again, we have a development of Ezekiel as a poet. Now Ezekiel can control over his emotion, because there is a self-control, there is a steadiness. Ezekiel now can use metaphorically his details, and he has also grown as a greater as an observer of society. His next 2 volumes, The Unfinished Man and The Exact Man, are publications from the Writer's Workshop. As I told you, this is the commonality between these 2 volumes. And these two volumes are quite mature products of his poetic genius. His 2 most anthologized poems, there are many poems which are anthologized, but the 2 most anthologized poems, Night of the Scorpion and Poet Lover Birdwatcher, are from this period, from the collection The Exact Name. Although particular themes are not specific to any volume, it's very difficult to locate a particular theme to a particular volume. A philosophic depth and a visionary attitude coming from the most mundane reality marks the poems. So what is very unique about these 2 collections published from the Writer's Workshop, Kolkata or Calcutta, is the philosophic depth and a visionary attitude. Again, if we go into his next 2 volumes, that is Hymns in Darkness and Latter-day Psalms, and perhaps his 2 most famous volumes, because these 2 collections seem to establish his fame permanently. He was awarded Sahitya Akademi Award. He was bestowed the Sahitya Akademi Award in 1983, and he received this award for his Latter-day Psalms. The volume Hymns in Darkness, which was published more than a decade after his last volume was published, deals with reorientation of the Vedic hymns that he would read while living alone in a room. So, as I told you, these 2 volumes, the last 2 volumes, the 6th volume and the 7th volume, have a commonality. And what is that common factor? This is the portrayal of religiosity, portrayal of religion. Now, not just Christian concern, but ancient Vedic tradition gets reflected here, as I marked here. Portrayal of religion. Now we have to remember that this volume, that is Hymns in Darkness, was written after his parents had died, and he was perhaps having deep meditation of life. This aloneness or aloofness is also the way his next and seventh volume was written. So this is again another commonality, that both the volumes are composed when the poet used to spend time alone. And the Latter-day Psalms, this was composed, the last volume, the seventh volume, Latter-day Psalms was composed when Ezekiel attended Rotterdam International Poetry Festival for reading poems. Or poetry from 11th to 17th June in the year 1978. So Ezekiel attended an international poetry festival called Rotterdam International Poetry Festival, and during that poetry festival, he composed the poems which were later collected in the volume called Latter-day Psalms. And this volume was also translated into Assamese and is regarded by a critic called Ajit Khullar as an outstanding contribution to Indian English literature for the variety of its modes of utterance and moods, sense of alienation, irony, tempered with compassion and high technical skill. Now let me repeat the quotation. The quotation is from Ajit Khullar, and Khullar makes this observation in a review article of the volume, and the review article is titled Old Psalms for New Times. I repeat, Old Psalms for New Times. Now Khullar says, quote, this volume, quote, is an outstanding contribution to Indian English literature for the variety of its modes of utterance and moods, sense of alienation, irony, tempered with compassion and high technical skill, unquote. You can compare this, or this can be compared to the poetry of Hopkins, who was, as you know, a priest poet. But what remains special about Ezekiel is that he was not a priest like Hopkins, but still he harbored a deep meditative brooding. So despite not being a priest, he had the capacity of having a deep meditative brooding, a philosophical outlook which persuaded his writing, which propelled his writing. Not just the ancient Sanskrit tradition or Christian tradition that gets reflected in his poetry, but Buddhist tradition or Buddhist traditional Zen philosophy or Tao philosophy also finds a place in his poetry. So, as I told you initially in my lecture, that it's very difficult to pin down through categorizations Ezekiel's poems, or in fact any poet's poems, and I told you that the three categorizations, that is the introspective poems, retrospective poems and metrospective poems, are not enough to have a complete understanding of Ezekiel as a poet, because the portrayal of religion, which is one of the chief features, in fact, I think the most important feature of his poems. Now, if we look at this collection, that is Hymns in Darkness, these hymns are composed following the Sanskrit Vedic tradition, and his next collection, Latter-day Psalms, this collection was composed, the poems in this collections were composed following the Christian tradition, but not just the ancient Sanskrit tradition or Christian tradition that gets reflected in his poetry, but there is also in his poetry Buddhist tradition of Zen philosophy or Tao philosophy. Now, what is this Zen philosophy? In his Nudes 1978, he wrote a series of sonnets, series of actually 14 sonnets, which is called Nudes 1978. Now, in these poems, you'll have Zen philosophy. Now, what is this Zen philosophy? Zen philosophy is at bottom a meditation in sitting posture. So, Zen philosophy means meditation in sitting posture. This philosophy actually talks about gaining perfection or wisdom that a person can have through practice, such as meditation, as opposed to through theoretical knowledge, because theoretical knowledge depends on language and language is highly discriminatory. So let me repeat, what is this Zen philosophy? Zen philosophy is actually a philosophy which focuses on gaining wisdom or perfection through meditation or practice, as opposed to having theoretical knowledge. Because theoretical knowledge is gained through language, whatever language it may be, is gained through language, and that language is highly discriminatory. So when you gain a wisdom, or when you try to gain a wisdom, that wisdom should be gained through practice and not through theory or mere dry knowledge. That is what Zen philosophy talks about, and his Nudes 1978 is actually a delineation of this philosophy. Now, another important aspect of these poems, of these sonnet of 14 of these 14 sonnets, is that Ezekiel here focuses on nudity and nakedness, and he makes a difference between nudity and nakedness. While he seems to say that nakedness is raw, primeval or primal, nudity is the next of nakedness. Nudity is something related to art, something beyond mere physical. Now, as he portrays a highly formal religion, that is Zen philosophy, he seems to go beyond the portrayal of body, beyond the portrayal of sex, beyond the portrayal of love or physical love. Now, this aspect can be compared to the metaphysical tradition incepted by John Donne and other poets. Because in metaphysical tradition also, Donne seems to uphold these raw passion, lust of life, but Donne doesn't stop there, or metaphysical poets do not stop there. They seem to go beyond this physical love into a kind of spiritual plane. Here also we get in these 14 sonnets written by Ezekiel, same thing. So these are the themes that, these are some of the themes. You might find some other themes that bind Ezekiel's volumes. Now, the next point that I will focus is Ezekiel as a modern poet. Now, there are 3 points from which I try to analyze Ezekiel as a modern poet. And now, this is a very common level, modern, attached to a poet, to a poet of any literature. But our task here gets somewhat easier because we have already talked about some of the features of his poetry, and I hope by now you have understood why Ezekiel is important and how Ezekiel, or in what ways Ezekiel has marked a departure from his predecessors and marked a unique stamp in his practice of poetry writing. As I told you, his poetry is no longer a continuation of earlier tradition with Gandhian influence or nationalistic sentiment. Any piece of literature in pre-independence time, pre-independence Indian time, would directly or indirectly refer to Gandhi. Be it R.K. Narayan's novels or Raja Rao's fiction or Desrosiers' poetry. In all of them, you will find nationalism, freedom, struggle, and so on and so forth. But here is a poet, Ezekiel that is, who broke free from that hangover of pre-colonial tradition and colonial hangover and registered a unique quality or mark. Apart from this departure from his predecessors, so this is a departure, as I pointed out in the first point in the slide. Apart from this departure from his predecessors, Ezekiel's poetry portrays reality in a unique manner. A realism which is related to art and life. Now here, let's take a quotation from Bruce King, who comments, their poems, their concerns, here it is written in red ink in the slide, their concerns, the poem's concerns, obviously Ezekiel's poems, are at least as much about the way art should imitate reality as about conflicts between art and reality. So, here Ezekiel is a modern poet because he, through his poetry, tends to unfold the conflict between art and reality. How arts should imitate reality, or how art should reflect reality. Here comes that famous verisimilitude factor. If art at all needs to reflect reality, then how should it be done? Should art imitate reality as reality is, or should art imitate reality and at the same time transform reality, mixing or incorporating the poet's imagination? That's the question, and that's the point that Ezekiel's poems at large tend to address, and that's why this concern makes Ezekiel a modern poet. This was not the concern with the pre-colonial, pre-independence or other poets who came before or who preceded Ezekiel. Now, another thing that I think is very important insofar as Ezekiel as a modern poet is concerned is his frankness, is his forthrightness. A frank attitude, a confessional attitude is an important feature of his poems. Now, many of us who read Kamala Das, tend to think that Kamala Das is a confessional poet. But here is a poet who can also be labeled as a confessional poet, because in many of his introspective poems, that is poems on love, poems on marriage, he confesses his past event. For example, there is a very famous poem called Background Casually, and in that poem, that is Background Casually, Ezekiel goes confessional. There are other poems also, and I will refer to them later on if I get time. But the tone of confessionality is an important aspect. So I hope you have understood that Ezekiel can be affirmed as a modern poet who took up poetry not as a hobby, but who for the first time in India had a kind of professional attitude to poetry writing, and he took up poetry as perhaps he took up his life. That's why Ezekiel is no longer another poet in a traditional form, traditional mode, but he is a departure. His poems are clearly a departure. As I told you, I think I have made this point earlier, that he struggled initially to publish his poems. That's why I have added this note on the publication of his poems. Publishing his poems was not easy initially. He had to self-publish his poems, his 60 poems, which was published in 1953, and the third, that is his next collection, and the third were privately printed. 1 minute. Privately printed. Calcutta's Writers' Workshop, which published 2 of his volumes in 1960 and 1965, withdrew for the next 2 volumes. I mean, he published 2 of his volumes from this famous publication house based in Kolkata, that is Writers' Workshop. But after that, I mean, after publishing 2 volumes, only 2 volumes, Writers' Workshop did not publish any more of Ezekiel's volume. Later on, Oxford University Press published his Hymns in Darkness and Latter-day Psalms, and also his collected poems. Now, here is an analysis or comparison between 3 poets, 3 contemporary poets, that is Dom Morris, A.K. Ramanujan, and Nissim Ezekiel. Bruce King, again, that famous critic, Bruce King in the book 3 Indian Poets makes this comparison. Now let me read the quotation, then I will make my comment. Morris has more natural talent with regard to sound patterns and rhythms, but his ease within the conventions of English poetry has at times inhibited an evolution of style. Ramanujan has greater technique, a more complex vision, and revises his poems until they have an unusual richness of sound and significance. To read through Ezekiel's collected poems is to become aware of an increasing ease, an ease of address, an ease of manner, an ease of discussing the self, and ease of writing which only becomes possible after years of experience, so that writing becomes a Zen act, an internalized discipline in which facility and the facile, perfection and slackness are near neighbors. Now, you might quote this in your answers, in your analysis of Ezekiel, but here let me have an understanding of this quotation. What is special about Morris? Dom Morris has more natural talent, more natural flow as a poet. A.K. Ramanujan, on the other hand, has greater technique, but their greater technique and natural talent seem to be overshadowed by one fault, and that fault is the smoothness, the easiness, the ease that Ezekiel seems to possess. As I told you, that Ezekiel is held as the poet laureate of the mundane. Because he is the poet laureate of the mundane, because there is a greater ease as you read his poems, an ease of address. He takes up any mundane theme, any reality, and makes that reality into the subject matter of his poems. Initially this seems very absurd, very boring, but this is what makes Ezekiel a poet laureate of the mundane. An ease of manner, an ease of discussing the self, an ease of writing which only becomes possible after years of experience, so that writing becomes a Zen act. I have already explained to you what Zen act is. This is how there is a comparison between Ezekiel, Dom Morris, and A.K. Ramanujan. Later on, we have to analyze two poems, and that is A Morning Walk and Hymns in Darkness. So let us try to read the two poems and analyze the poems.